country is exploding because of you.
My son was not a loser, was not a sucker. You're the sucker. You're the loser. Excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death. I wasn't really going to run until I saw the horrible job he did. He's destroying our country.
You have the morals of an alley cat.
Give you a minute, sir.
I didn't have sex with a porn star.
Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The big global story: U.S. President Joe Biden and his Republican challenger Donald Trump squared off in the first presidential debate moderated by CNN. Both leaders sparred on several issues, including immigration and abortion. Leaders in the Democratic Party and fundraisers have sounded the alarm after President Biden struggled to land his lines. The CNN moderators also faced a backlash for failing to fact-check Donald Trump. In the lead-up to the debate, polls showed Trump and Biden in a tight race, though the Republican appeared to be edging ahead. We're now joined by Ambassador Navteej Sarna, former Indian envoy to the United States, and Sean Trent, senior elections analyst for Real Clear Politics. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us right now. Ambassador Sarna, if I were to ask you, clearly President Biden was struggling there. Many have described his performance as disastrous. Do you think there will be some sort of hard thinking within the Democrat camp now with regard to their prospects in the election?
Well, thank you, Parikshit. I think you're definitely right. It was a very tough night out for President Biden, and he has come out second best, honestly speaking. I think if some hard thinking may take time to evolve, but certainly there is increased anxiety, almost panic in the Democratic ranks, that can he really be the president for another 4 years? Is he the right candidate? I mean, this debate was President Biden's idea, frankly, and he wanted it to be, and his campaign wanted it to be, a critical moment in which they could take up President Trump on substantive issues and make very clear to their audience that here is a clear choice of who you want. And their target was really the undecided voter or the Democrat who is still struggling to make up his mind about President Biden, or to simply get people off the couch, as they say. Now, I doubt that this debate has done anything to do that. So there is going to be some amount of soul searching, some amount of thinking amongst the top ranks of the Dems, and as well as past presidents, I would say people like President Obama and President Clinton, to see, is this the right man? It may be too late to change, but certainly this is going to be a thought.
Right. Sean, if we look at all the polls from yesterday, the latest polls after the presidential debate, they all show almost a 4 to 7 to 10-point lead for Donald Trump. How much of an impact does the first presidential debate have on a candidate's campaign?
Well, I think you have to look at it two ways. The first is, what kind of an impact does it have in terms of what President Biden needed? President Biden needed a reset in this debate. He, as you say, he's trailing in most of the polls. He's trailing in the polls in the Electoral College. And so what he needed was to kind of hit the reset button, say, okay, the campaign starts today. Everything you've heard about me is wrong. I'm tanned, rested, and ready, as the saying in the States goes, and I can be your president for the next 4 years. And that just didn't happen last night. And I feel comfortable saying that because Republicans and Democrats agree, which almost never happens these days in America, that didn't happen. The big question now is, do things go in reverse? Do things actually get worse for the president, which is not something he can afford right now? Time, we'll have to see over time, but this was not a reassuring performance for swing state voters. Now, I will say, and this is something you heard come out of Democrats' mouths yesterday, and I think it's valuable, is that in a Senate campaign in America last cycle, John Fetterman, who had suffered a stroke, had a similarly disastrous debate performance in the swing state of Pennsylvania and ended up winning by 5 points. There was some sympathy for him among voters for how he performed. It's possible that President Biden will gain some of that sympathy, or people won't like the way that President Trump came off. But that is not what the thinking is among professionals today. I think it's a bit of wishful thinking, but it's a possibility we have to keep in mind over the next few days.
Right. That indeed is an important point. You have to see the sympathy vote as well. Ambassador Sarna, if I were to come to you, now, when it comes to Democrats changing heart, it's very difficult, we believe, and it can only take place if President Biden decides to step aside himself and say that somebody else should be the Democrat nominee. Is that correct? And what could possibly lead to that? Do you think senior Democrats would have to nudge President Biden?
Well, you're right that it is difficult to go into reverse gear at this moment in terms of choice of candidate. And essentially, it can only happen if Joe Biden himself decides that, no, it's wrong to carry on as the presidential candidate and withdraws. And then, of course, there will be a lot of chaos, the Democratic convention. But until then, until he says so, I think it's not more than anything but wishful thinking and anxiety attacks. He did say immediately after the debate yesterday that let's go on and see you at the next one, which means that he had already rejected, for the moment at least, the idea of giving up. It's quite possible that you might see senior Democrats going up to him and passing the messages that, don't you really think so? But if he does, as I said, there would have to be, it would have to be possibly before the Democratic convention, through the roll call when it happens, or at the Democratic convention, because the state primaries have already been completed. And the candidates who are committed to Mr. Biden are committed to support him at the Democratic convention in Chicago. So it is going to be difficult. And it won't even get off the ground unless he decides that he doesn't want to go ahead.
Right. Sean, when we speak about Trump's performance, President Biden said that if Trump gets elected, this would be the first time when a convicted felon would be taking office. How do you think Donald Trump performed as a presidential candidate during the debate? There were a lot of falsehoods. Where all did you think he scored? And does he have a strong chance to continue being the Republican nominee right up till November?
Well, I'll take your second question first, which is that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. He has an overwhelmingly high approval rating within the Republican Party. The Republican Party is convinced that the convictions against him are politically motivated. And so there's just no taste in the Republican Party for abandoning him as a candidate. Now, as to his performance last night, I thought on the substance he wasn't particularly good, particularly as the night wore on. He had some good answers at the beginning of the debate, but you could see him get tired. Donald Trump is not the candidate he was 4 or 8 years ago. He has, again, in American parlance, lost a few steps as well. The issue is, though, that he just exudes energy. And for most casual voters, it's not so much about the substance. Most voters were watching that debate maybe in the background. They were talking to friends. They were cleaning up dinner. If you just watch that debate with the sound off, which is the equivalent of how a lot of voters interpret these debates, Biden was standing there at times with his mouth open. He just looked old and tired, and Trump looked full of energy. He's not. He's 78 years old, and he has missteps and everything else. But he just looked fully in control of himself, and that is the main thing he had going for him. Yes, Donald Trump lied a lot, but Donald Trump has been lying a lot in presidential runs for almost a decade now. That's built into voters' perceptions of him. It's not something that I particularly understand or approve of, but for whatever reason, you have to be honest with yourself. Among most voters right now, it doesn't seem to be affecting how they interpret his presidential run.
Right. Ambassador Sarna, if I were to come back to you, in terms of changes in key policy vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the global economy and relations with countries like India, how much could this drastically change with the Trump Republican presidency?
Well, I think the foreign policy aspect of it was more than one would have expected, but still it did not dominate the debate. I think the one area on which there is a distinct difference is, of course, Russia, NATO, Europe. With Biden being in favor of a more, pushing America's global standing, of working with allies, of being a very strong supporter for Ukraine. And Donald Trump, if he were to be president, expected to be, again, isolationist, bringing NATO to book in terms of payments, etc. And he has already said it, that, he would settle the war while he was president designate. That means before he was inaugurated on January 20 next year. Now, with what magic wand he is going to do that, he has not yet revealed. As far as Israel-Gaza conflict is concerned, I think the two people have differed less. He, in fact, was critical of Biden being a bit soft, in terms of, support to Israel and sort of stopping some of the ammunitions. And he at one stage, he called him a Palestinian, and a bad Palestinian at that. Now, this shows that, the fundamentals of Middle East policy are going to remain confused, are going to remain transactional. I don't think he didn't come out straight in favor of a Palestinian state or even a two-state solution. So I wouldn't hold out much hope for a sudden, very bright, visionary policy on the Middle East. And surprisingly, China did not come out much in the debate, except almost in passing. Again, perhaps because on China, there is very little daylight between Biden and Donald Trump. In fact, Biden has carried on what Trump started on China and ratcheted it up in some aspects, particularly in high-tech trade and so on. So let's see. I think foreign policy will evolve as the campaigns go on, as the debate goes on, as the situations on the ground go on. But I think one thing that will suffer if Trump would come would be the transatlantic relationships, with the support to Ukraine, and he will certainly have a more a friendly attitude towards President Putin, with all the implications that carries.
Right. Important points there, Ambassador Sarna. Now, coming to you, Sean, as someone who has been looking and analyzing election surveys, polls over many years now, what are the issues which are critical to voters in this run-up to the election in November? In the last 3 to 4 months, which are the issues which really matter? Is it the personality of the candidate? Is it inflation? Is it jobs, the state of the economy, immigration?
It's interesting, and I'm going to sound like I'm giving all kinds of bad news for Joe Biden here, and I kind of am, because the situation was not good to start with. But if you ask Democrats what the most important issues are to them, they will list off abortion rights. Our Supreme Court made it possible for states to make abortion illegal last 2 years ago, and that's been a big campaign issue. But they also will list democracy, and those are the themes that President Biden has been pounding. If you ask Republicans what's important to them, they will list immigration, inflation. Our inflation rate has come down, and in an international context is quite good, but prices are still quite a bit higher here than they were at the beginning of President Biden's terms. And they will list the economy. The big thing, the problem Joe Biden has at an issue level is that independents as well list immigration, inflation, and the economy. So you have a situation where the voters who decide this election going into this debate were already open to Republican messaging on what the issues of the day were. And that's why it was so important for Joe Biden to hit the reset button. Again, this is something that astounds me, but it has come up in multiple surveys. If you ask people whether President Joe Biden's presidency has been a success, somewhere around 40% of Americans will say yes. If you ask Americans now whether President Trump's first term was a success, that number is up above 50%. These are just the cold numbers that we are getting. And so it just shows that President Biden was in a tough spot going into this debate. He needs to change the dynamic and change what the conversations in American households were. He'll have other opportunities. There'll be a second debate. There'll be the convention. So, hope for him is not lost. But this debate really was a huge missed opportunity on a campaign playing field that right now clearly favors former President Donald Trump.
All right, we've run out of time, but Ambassador Sarna, Sean Trent, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Interesting times ahead as far as the election in America goes. And